Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into historian Bernard Porter's fascinating look at how Britain, wait for it, totally accidentally stumbled into an 80-year occupation of Egypt. We're going to unpack a piece of history that reads less like some grand master plan and way more like a series of panicked, unintended consequences. It's a really brilliant look into the mechanics of imperial power, how it expands and ultimately how it shatters. 44%. Imagine buying just a 44% share in a canal, and somehow that spirals into a decades-long military empire. It is literally the ultimate real estate deal gone wrong. How does a simple financial investment transform into an outright occupation? Well, that is the exact question Porter answers in his work, and it's what we should keep in the back of our minds as we navigate through this history today. So here is our roadmap for today. 1. Buying the Suez Canal. 2. The Veiled Protectorate. 3. Rising nationalism and revolt. 4. A nominal independence. And finally, 5. The Suez Crisis collapse.
Let's get right into Section 1, buying the Suez Canal.
You know, Porter argues that back in the 1850s, Britain actually preferred what's called an informal empire. They basically just wanted to control the money and the trade routes without the massive headache of actually ruling Egypt directly. Direct rule, well, that's expensive, it's messy, and it requires putting real military boots on the ground, which means paying for those boots. By just using economic influence, Britain hoped to get all the perks of a territory without taking on any of the actual administrative burdens. It was essentially a strategy of maximum leverage with minimum responsibility.
Now, to put things into perspective, by 1875, the newly opened Suez Canal was the absolute vital highway to India, and a massive 80%, that's 8 out of every 10 ships passing through it, were British. India was the crown jewel of the British Empire, and this canal drastically cut travel times. Controlling this absolute choke point wasn't just good for business. It was vital for imperial communications and defense against rival powers like France and Russia. So, when the chance to buy that 44% share popped up in 1875, Britain absolutely jumped on it.
Moving on to Section 2, the Veiled Protectorate.
As it turns out, informal empires are incredibly fragile, especially when the local economy crashes. It's really like a line of dominoes. First, the Egyptian ruler, Ismail Pasha, racked up massive debt for modernization projects. When Egypt couldn't pay, Britain and France staged a financial intervention in 1876, basically seizing the national checkbook. Obviously, that breeds intense local resentment, which led to Britain deposing Ismail in 1879. That move sparked a furious nationalist uprising led by Colonel Arabi. Suddenly, to protect their interests, Britain felt completely forced to send in the military, crushing the rebellion and fully occupying Egypt by 1882. Notice how incredibly fast we went from a banking issue to a full-blown invading army? So, after that 1882 occupation, Egypt became what's called a veiled protectorate. This meant it was technically, officially, still part of the Ottoman Empire, but let's be real, it was effectively ruled by the British. It was an elaborate diplomatic fiction. On paper, Britain wasn't in charge at all, but behind the scenes, British officials were pulling every single string. This totally improvised setup happened because Britain stepped in to secure the canal, and then found themselves either unable or completely unwilling to leave. Now, the British administration under Lord Cromer did actually stabilize the economy, improve irrigation, and reduce debt. But, and this is a massive but, they completely excluded Egyptians from having any political power, justifying it with deeply prejudiced, racist assumptions about their capacity for self-rule. Porter points out this is the classic paradox of the era. The British pointed to material improvements like better agriculture as proof their occupation was benevolent, yet they structurally locked out the very people they were supposedly helping, relying on racist ideologies to justify staying where they weren't invited.
That brings us to Section 3, rising nationalism and revolt.
You simply cannot exclude a whole population from its own governance without triggering a massive reaction. Despite any material improvements, harsh repression only poured fuel on the fire of Egyptian nationalism. Take the 1906 Denshawite incident, for example. A local dispute between British officers and Egyptian villagers escalated into incredibly harsh, disproportionate executions and imprisonments of locals. It completely shattered any remaining illusion of a benevolent occupation. It acted like a lightning rod, proving to the Egyptian people that the British were there as conquerors, for sure, not just friendly advisors. So how did the British respond to all this unrest? Well, they developed a pretty chaotic pattern. They'd experiment with some vague political reform, maybe expand Egyptian participation just a tiny bit, but the second protests grew, bam, right back to strict censorship and making arrests without trial. Ultimately, they operated on the deeply flawed belief that coercion just worked better than making any real meaningful concessions. They were basically trying to keep the lid on a boiling pot without ever actually turning down the heat.
Then World War I came along, and it ripped away the veiled part of the protectorate entirely. Britain officially made Egypt a formal protectorate in 1914 to secure their military operations in the Middle East. But after the war, all those unfulfilled promises of reform finally reached a breaking point, igniting the massive 1919 revolution. We're talking nationwide strikes, mass protests, and violence. The Egyptian people expected the independence they felt they had earned, and when Britain refused, the entire nation erupted. Let's look at Section 4, a nominal independence. The 1919 revolution made it undeniably clear that the old way of doing things was completely dead. So, in 1922, Britain granted Egypt independence. But honestly, this was a masterclass in reading the fine print. Sure, they gave Egypt a flag and a parliament, but Britain secretly retained absolute control over everything that actually mattered strategically: defense, foreign policy, the administration of Sudan, and most importantly, the Suez Canal. Porter really emphasizes this point. It was an informal empire hiding behind nominal sovereignty. It was independence in name only. Even when a later treaty in 1936 offered a bit more local autonomy, the British absolutely ensured their military boots remained firmly planted right beside the Suez Canal. They were perfectly willing to compromise on domestic Egyptian governance, but there was absolutely no way they were surrendering their strategic imperial lifeline to India. However, as we moved into the Second World War, that military presence was becoming incredibly unpopular.
Which forces us right into our final section, the Suez Crisis collapse.
Post-World War II, the world was changing fast, and a much weaker Britain faced a rapid, devastating sequence of losses. It started with the 1952 revolution, where Egyptian nationalists overthrew the British-backed monarchy. By 1954, Britain was forced to actually start withdrawing its troops. And then came 1956, when Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain panicked and attempted a military intervention to take it back. It was a complete disaster. It completely exposed Britain's new dependence on the United States, who famously forced them to back down, and it finalized their total imperial collapse in the region by 1967. So what is the absolutely crucial takeaway from Bernard Porter's analysis here? It's that this entire 80-year occupation wasn't some grand, confident master plan. It was a panicked, reactive improvisation. Britain expanded its control not out of ideological strength, but because they were constantly responding to local crises and geopolitical threats to their trade. When their informal economic influence failed, they resorted to military occupation because they were quite literally too weak to control the region any other way. Stepping into a formal empire was actually a glaring sign of weakness. It leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to chew on long after this explainer ends. If the greatest empires are built by accident, how easily can they collapse? Power built on panic, improvisation, and the constant suppression of a local populace is just inherently unstable. If an entire empire can be triggered by a simple debt crisis and a scramble to protect a canal, think about how fast it can crumble when those global dynamics inevitably shift. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this history, and remember to always keep questioning the real foundations of power.